Okay, Phil Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Hello, everybody out there. I have a guest today, Sam Hood, the author of 3 books pertaining to the Civil War and Reconstruction. And his latest book is Patriots Twice. It's about a number of men that served in the Confederacy, but then demonstrated that they were patriots, American patriots, after the war. Sam, you can hear me okay?
Yeah,
Okay. So why
sure.
don't we get started? I think there are 3 of them that we discussed you might want to begin with, and why don't we start with those and see where that leads?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to do this. And before I talk about these 3 individuals, let me just say something in general. I started researching the book just purely out of curiosity as to what a lot of these Confederates did after the war. The war lasted, 4 years, 3 years for most of the men, and then they had several decades afterwards. And you kind of wonder what did they do after they took off the uniform and laid down the muskets, and it was astonishing to me for what some of these men did. I had no particular criteria when I started. It was totally subjective as to who would quote unquote make the book. I was limited, obviously, in size. But just generally speaking, 10 post-war US presidents, beginning with US Grant and ending with Woodrow Wilson, appointed former Confederates to many federal positions, including a Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, 3 Associate Justices of the US Supreme Court, Attorney General, 2 Secretaries of the US Navy, believe it or not, numerous diplomats, judges. So I was very surprised at that. 8 former Confederate officers were US Army generals during the Spanish-American War. I had previously known just through general knowledge of a few, but there turned out 8. There may have been more. Most history books, as a lot of people know, should not be the history of something. It should be a history of something, because historians only know what they know at the time they're writing. So there were presidents of several professional societies, the American Medical Association. There were 4 former Confederate surgeons served as president, the American Bar Association, American Chemical Society, and Sierra Club, and so forth. Founders of many universities, including 4 universities exclusively for African Americans. My book covered these. It's done in a narrative style rather than just an alphabetical roster. Other things, governors of non-Confederate states. There was a U.S. congressman from New York that was a former Confederate, a mayor of Los Angeles, a mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Just some really surprising positions that these men held after their military service. So anyway, I'm just going to mention 3. We'll talk about 3 here, and these are not. Some of the viewers may have heard of Moses Ezekiel. Especially after I start talking to them, might remind them. But I picked a couple of others that maybe people haven't heard of. They weren't in the generals in the U.S. Army, and they weren't in federal positions. But we'll start with John William Mallet, and Mallet was a native of Ireland and came to the U.S. In his early 20s to study, and never went back. And Mallet, was born in Dublin, came to the U.S., And he published a paper entitled, believe it or not, The Chemical Examination of Kilonite. That's what he did when he was 18 years old. And, but anyway, he traveled to the US, and at the outbreak of the Civil War, he enlisted as a private in a Confederate cavalry regiment, but due to his intellect and other abilities, he was on the staff of Robert Rhodes. He being a chemist, physicist, he spent most of the war as a lieutenant colonel and superintendent of the Confederate military, the Confederate laboratories in Macon, Georgia. And after the war, he resided first in New Orleans and began a career as an educator. And I'll read some of the positions he held. He was first professor of chemistry at the University of Louisiana, earned a medical degree in 1868. The following year, he accepted a teaching position at UVA, University of Virginia, and he conducted research on industrial and agricultural chemistry. He lectured at Johns Hopkins in 1878 and 1879. He taught chemistry, and physics at the University of Texas in 1884. Then he went on to teach chemistry at the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. And then he returned to UVA and he retired in 1908 as a professor emeritus. During his lifetime, Mallet served on the U.S. Assay Commission. He was a member of the Royal Society in the UK, College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the Medical Society of Virginia, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the London Society of Arts, the Chemical Society of France, the German Chemical Society, the American Philosophical Society, and he was president of the American Chemical Society in 1882. And he received honorary degrees from William and Mary, University of Mississippi, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and University of Pennsylvania. And he is today, there's a Mallet Hall at the University of Alabama, and there is an honors program called the Mallet Assembly at the University of Alabama. So John Mallet is a Confederate officer that we perhaps haven't heard of, who was quite impressive. The aforementioned Moses Jacob Ezekiel, he was a Jewish Confederate, grew up in Richmond, and was the first American Jew the first Jew to attend VMI. And at VMI, he participated in the Battle of Newmarket. But after the war, he graduated. He went back to VMI and graduated in 1866, and then he attended the Medical College of Virginia and was going to be a doctor, but he moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, to study sculpting. He followed the advice of his instructors in Cincinnati, and he moved to Berlin, Germany for further training at the Royal Art Academy. And at the age of 29, Ezekiel became the first non-German to win the Michael Beer Prix de Rome Award for sculpting. He moved to Rome at age 29 or 30 and stayed there for the rest of his life. Became very much a worldwide sculptor. He was knighted by various countries, King Emmanuel of Italy, Italian King Umberto, just countless awards that he received. He many of the sculptures are still around today. Unfortunately, the Stonewall Jackson statue that was recently removed from VMI was done by Moses Ezekiel. And there, by the way, another copy of it stands at on the Capitol grounds of the West Virginia State Capitol. His sculptures are in Chicago, Arlington Cemetery, at some of the Confederate prisoner of war camps. And Ezekiel lived into he actually volunteered for the American Red Cross when World War I broke out, and he was going to organize some assistance and some aid for the Allied troops in Europe, but he died in 1917. So he's buried at in Lexington, Virginia, and of all of his awards, what he had on his stone, he has Sergeant of Cadets, VMI. And the last one I'll mention, it's actually two brothers, John and Joseph LeConte, and they were originally from Georgia, and they too were chemists and very accomplished academically. They joined the Confederate Army, and they served the war in the Bureau of Nitra in developing, gunpowder, explosives, ordnances, and stuff. They were lieutenants, though they got paid at the grade of major, so they both wrote after the war. They don't know whether they were majors or lieutenants. After the war, they moved to California. And John LeConte was involved in teaching, and John LeConte was the second and fourth president of Cal Berkeley. And I've always thought that's kind of interesting, Cal Berkeley being a sort of a hotbed of progressivism, yet one of the first couple of presidents of the university was a Confederate veteran. His brother, John's brother, Joseph, was a friend. He was very much active in environmental issues. He became close friends with John Muir, the iconic American preservationist. LeConte and Muir were both instrumental in designating Yosemite National Park as a landmark. And LeConte, in honor of the LeConte brothers, there is a Mount LeConte in the Great Smoky National Park, Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, but in California, there is in Yosemite Park, there's a Mount LeConte, there's a LeConte Valley, a LeConte Glacier, a LeConte River, one of the branches of the river, and Muir and LeConte both founded the Sierra Club, and which is another well-known progressive organization. And there was a lodge built in the 1930s in Yosemite, and it was called the LeConte Lodge in honor of the LeConte brothers. It was recently had its name changed. It's now the Sierra Lodge, which it's become. He supposedly wrote some things during his time which are considered politically incorrect today. There's also a LeConte Middle School in San Francisco that has now had its name changed as well. But the LeContes were incredibly accomplished. And to finish up here with John LeConte. He's chairman of the Department of Chemical Pharmacology, Mineralogy, and Geology at the University of South Carolina. He was chairman of the Department of Geology at Cal Berkeley, a professor of physiology and geology, again at Cal Berkeley. interim president of Cal Berkeley, co-founder of Sierra Club, president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Philosophical Society, the National Academy of Sciences. And again, the namesake of so many landmarks in Yosemite. But, as with a lot of former Confederates, once it was learned that he had served in the Confederate military, those names are coming down. But those are three that perhaps some of the viewers, Phil, haven't necessarily heard from. But I don't know, their CV looks a little more impressive than mine, and I have a lot of respect for their memory and their legacy.
Very good. Thank you for the synopsis. Just as a matter of interest, when you mentioned the Mallet name before we got started, I said, that's familiar, and I misplaced it. I have written an article for the Virginia Tech Essential Civil War Curriculum on ordnance for the Union and the Navy and Confederate armies. That's where I ran across Mallet, the work that he did in Macon. That was, for me, that was an interesting article to write. And those of you that might have an interest, I would encourage you to look at that, because also the LeConte brothers were apparently involved there. Now, I don't recall reading about them, though I may well have. But their position at the time was not as high as Mallet's, I assume. Is that right?
Correct. And by the way, I mentioned my book, and I mentioned that it was in narrative form rather than just a alphabetical roster. And what I did, I've constructed the book to where it could be used by people who might be trying to defend a landmark or a monument. And in the chapter on education, Phil, excuse me, I actually have categorized by universities. And it's funny, you mentioned Virginia Tech. So I have a section in the book exclusively on Confederates who were involved, who taught, or were actually, there were, as I'm working off of memory, there was 2 or 3 presidents of Virginia Tech who were former Confederates. So McBride, I guess, and there's still a McBride Hall there. Scott Shipp, who was a Naval Academy guy. He served as an interim president for a while. But anyway, I have professors that I didn't look for college professors.
Let's get back to LeConte.
Yeah.
My recollection is that now, has Berkeley dropped the name as well? Because there was a LeConte Hall, I believe, in Berkeley.
I don't think so. I don't know. It's, they do so much of this, it's hard to keep up with.
Yeah, it would be hard to imagine that they hadn't caught up with that yet. But this is just recollection. I was reading the development of the atomic bomb, and of course Oppenheimer was involved in that. It seems to me there were meetings in LeConte Hall.
Could be.
I don't know if that's still there.
Well, now I know the grades.
Just out of curiosity, did you come across the name Henry Morton Stanley?
Oh yeah.
But you didn't write about him?
Well, he's in there.
All right. Okay. How about Barry Benson of Augusta?
Benson, I'm familiar with him. I'm fascinated by the guy.
Right.
After I read his book. But again, because I was limited, there were people that did a whole lot more in their life than I have with mine, but just due to the limit, I didn't have time. He did a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Had you read Benson's book before you authored?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So you deliberately decided to exclude him. Nothing.
Well, just again, due to size, he founded, like some churches and some banks and some things which, were quite accomplished, but again, because of limits,
did you read about his involvement in the Leo Frank case?
No.
Okay, that was the Jewish guy in 1914 who was executed for raping.
Oh yeah.
You did read about that?
Yes, yes.
I think that given the tendency to destroy statues of Confederates, there's an example of a guy who came to the aid and assistance at his own expense of a minority who was, we don't know, but allegedly being railroaded in the conviction. And then, of
Yes.
course, an obvious one that you missed was, of course, or that we didn't discuss, was Joe Wheeler. That was intentional.
No, Joe Wheeler's in the book. He's one of 300.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you've got 300 in there.
Yeah,
Okay.
oh,
Well,
yeah.
now, which of the guys of these 300 do you think merits keeping a statue? I think I would make the case that LeConte Hall should stay there, but anyway, it's not. But what's your opinion of the 300? Who merits that their statue remains standing?
Oh, that's so hard. And again, it probably wouldn't be statues. It would be landmarks, as you say. LeConte Hall, Mallet Hall, education. University of Texas they're wanting to take down Ashbel Smith, who did so much for the university and also helped found Prairie View A&M, which is historically black college. Phil, there are so many of them. I wouldn't know.
So in other words, you might prefer that of those 300, the majority of them, or perhaps even the mass majority, should continue to be honored, and only.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I don't. Especially those to the military men as opposed to Confederate political figures. If somebody wants to argue, Jefferson Davis, let's say, if somebody wants to argue that, to me, there's perhaps an argument there, even though to me, history is history and all that. But, the military men they weren't fighting for any political thing, for a law, for slavery, or for this or that, or, they were fighting because they felt duty bound. So,
but of course, that opinion is prohibited on academia.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
But statues to Confederate soldiers, to me, are that they should be as off limits as anything else, actually.
Yeah, of course, I share that point of view, but what I was really getting at is there seems to be this universal belief among those that tear down the statues and, successfully advocate for that these soldiers really, they didn't have any noble reason or a respectable reason for joining the army and fighting as they did. But here's what I'm thinking: if any of those critics really read, for example, Company H by Sam Watkins or Barry Benson's Civil War book, how could they not like those guys?
Exactly.
It's impossible, I think, to actually read those books and come away disliking them for whatever religious or racial biases they might have. That was just a part of their life. That certainly by no means defining characteristic of their life.
Right. Of course, McPherson, wrote the book where he studied letters and diaries of Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers, and came to the conclusion that slavery had absolutely nothing to do with what a vast majority of both Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers fought for. And Alex, in my personal experience, Phil, I've been studying Civil War history intensely for 20 years. And my favorite genre is, as you say, it's Sam Watkins, it's Barry Benson. My favorite genre are the memoirs and the diaries of the men, of the common soldier. I cannot, off the top of my head, and I say this many times, I do not ever recall reading, and I know I'm interrupting myself. I know they're out there because I've had people say, oh yeah, well, look at this. I'd have never myself come upon a letter home to mom or to the wife, where any of these men have mentioned, I am here going through this hell and risking my life to keep blacks in bondage. I never have ever read that. And I have read thousands and thousands of not all, or all either entire letters or in part, or memoirs. And it's just, it was the furthest thing from the minds of the common soldiers, per my experiences. Now, again, politicians might be a different thing, but the common soldiers.
I agree with you completely. And, but there's two things I'd say about that. Number one is academia has multitude, and they have vaults of federal money in which to hire research assistants and tell them, go look for this. You know, right. If you go look for my history as when I was a teenager and I started fooling around with Playboy, and you want to focus on that, you know, you're going to come up with a different story than somebody who might look at me differently. But if you just focus on those things, that's the story you're going to get. And the other is, I mean, if you go back to old Shelby Foote, and, you know, when Ken Burns interviewed him, and even before that, when he wrote his books, there's a clip from Ken Burns, and he says, the slave was the soldiers on either side gave a damn about the blacks. Now, he may have overstated that, but he really made the point that it was a minimal consideration amongst the soldiers at the time.
At the time, sure.
Yeah, at the time. And now here's something else I want to get at. I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but I've been looking at the Reconstruction period. And there are some statues you can find where, you know, this statue is here to commemorate the reestablishment or the reinforcement or the reestablishment of white supremacy. And famously, I think the one involving the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, but also some others. And of course, that if you take that at face value, it's all very condemning. And probably a lot of it was meant at face value, certainly probably some of it. But the other thing that seems to be missing to me is that Brazil went from slavery to no slavery 20 years after the Confederacy. But they didn't have as much racial divide as we have. There is a case to be made that the racial divide that we had, the hostility that emerged, was at least partly a result of the rapid manipulation and rapid installment of black suffrage in the South. Because the Northerners didn't want black suffrage either. Black suffrage just simply became a way to establish carpetbag regimes, which became known as, quote, Negro rule, close quote, by the opponents. And so when those regimes were kicked out, that was referred to as reestablishment of white supremacy, which has a more nuanced meaning. Does that make any sense? What do you think?
Yeah, well, yeah, and when you were talking, I came to mind getting back to the LeContes, for example. The LeContes are quote unquote in trouble now because John LeConte wrote memoirs near the end of his life, and I was able to find them actually through the interlibrary alone, and there might be 2 copies on the planet, and I read it. He got in trouble for saying that emancipation was inhumane, in so many words, and he got in trouble for that, and that's why they started taking the names down. But it was in the context of, he said it was the way it was done was inhumane.
Exactly.
He said these people couldn't read and write. Most of them had no particular skills, and they owned nothing. And the instant emancipation, the way that it was done, basically, and released into a part of the country which was totally devastated. There was no economy, there was no industry. And what he said is that it was inhumane to not educate and give job skills, and shelter and sustenance. And I think that was also a problem
well, and that's a legitimate criticism. And in point of fact, I think it was behind a lot of the so-called, what's the West Virginia, white sulfur, or the manifesto,
White Sulphur Springs. Yeah.
the manifesto that was signed there by the former Confederate generals, including Lee. Did you ever run across that? I think that was one of the implications of what they were saying. We grew up with blacks. We can get along with blacks, but when you force a divide between them and then establish a hostility, a reason for hostility between them, the major goal of the occupation army and the Freedmen's Bureau should have been to bring the two sides together, but the opposite happened, bringing them apart. So I would link back to my point about Brazil. What happened in Brazil? Why did they not have all these same problems? Maybe they did. Maybe I don't know enough about that.
Yeah, I don't know either. But, again, Reconstruction was basically martial law. They also, as most people know, if you had been a previous office holder, if you were a public official before or during secession or at secession, you couldn't immediately hold public office.
I'd like to make a point there. Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts, who was a strict abolitionist, when he left office in '66, early '66, he said, if we do that, if we force the Southern whites to be unable to elect anyone to office that has demonstrated leadership qualities, we're going to turn those people into our enemies. This is John Andrew of Massachusetts making that point of view. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
I think that the people that are tearing down the statues are focusing on, they're categorizing the Southern white as just strictly evil. And there's no comprehension about how they too were impoverished. And the taxes in the South were paid by the property owners. The property owners were the ones that were at risk of losing their property to too high property taxes. That's a fact, but it's just not taken into consideration here. I guess what I'm getting at was the issue I would like to see academics approach legitimately, objectively. Was there misrule during Reconstruction or not? Now, I know what Eric Foner is going to say, but I don't think he knows any more about the South than a cow does about algebra. But go ahead.
Well, no, but I would say, Phil, this is so obvious as to sound kind of dumb, but everybody was in uncharted waters. After the war, the North won. The Union had to reassert local government, state government, most of the institutions, the banking institutions, the commerce.
I'd like to just interrupt with this point to get to your earlier point. The thought occurred to me, I forgot to mention it. Lincoln's idea when Arkansas was applying for readmission to the Union under Lincoln's plan, but he told them down there, he said, look, if you want to establish apprenticeship, a period of apprenticeship before granting citizenship and voting rights, that's okay. Apprenticeship would enable the blacks to have a trade, right? It seems to make sense.
It would allow anybody to learn a trade because it was a different economy after the war, immediately after the war. But
so it links into your point that if you just don't do anything, there's going to be chaos.
Yeah.
Or there's going to be totalitarian regimes.
Yeah, and like I said, it was uncharted water. So there wasn't a playbook, if you will, on the Reconstruction period. And, so like most huge government programs, I say that jokingly, sort of, you got people that exploit it, people that abuse it, people who are really trying their best, but they just kind of, fumble and stumble along. But to me, history is history, and
Yes,
it
but
distresses me.
but it's as you said, there is a history and another history. I mean, there's different stories to this history. So I appreciate that you're telling a story equally legitimate to a story that we're hearing from academia that's not quite the same. Just as I'm taking too long here and I don't want to turn this on to me, but just as a point of reference, you might find, since you've read Barry Benson's book, he had a younger brother, you remember?
Yes.
About a year younger. That brother moved to Texas, and he ended up prosperous out there. But he also wrote a novel, which I started. It's online, and the novel is fascinating because he's writing it from the point of view of a Confederate soldier, and he's drawing heavily upon his own experiences, which were much like Barry's. But there's sort of a supernatural aspect to it. Supernatural things are happening to him that take him out of harm's way at particular moments. And we don't know what's causing this. But it seems like gradually what's happening is the novel itself is taking on a Northern interpretation of the war. So I never finished it because, I don't know, just like you, I don't tend to read something unless it has something pertinent to do with the work that I'm doing. You may enjoy that. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, other than I'm glad I've met somebody else that loves Barry Benson's book. I mean, boy, you talk about a Superman. But no, like I said, I remember when I was speaking to a history professor from University of Southern Mississippi, many years ago, and he was saying, I think of this all the time. He said, we're going to have a time's going to come when we're going to have a hard time teaching any history prior to 1965. And I think of that all the time. And again, the Confederates are the low-hanging fruit, and people like us have been saying, when they get done with the Confederates, they're going to move on. And boy, haven't they? When you get to Kate Smith, when you go from Robert E. Lee to Kate Smith, you know that there's more to it out there than just the Confederacy. So it's hard to watch, and I'm doing what I can, you're doing what you can. And I just hope this thing, it runs its course and gets over with.
Okay, well, for Sam Hood and Phil Lee, thanks for watching.